In this example, I want to look at how I would scan, query, and filter a DynamoDB table. So I have DynamoDB running on my local machine, and I have DynamoDB on my local machine loaded with my baseball stats. So just to kind of give you an idea of what that baseball stats table is, I have three data sets inside of that table, some relating to baseball games, some relating to players, and some relating to so games, teams, and players are kind of the three data sets that I have inside of that table. And I want to be able to scan, query, and filter that data. And I want to give you some examples of how I would do all of those things. Okay, so if I jump over to my secondary tab inside of my terminal, so I have DynamoDB running on my local machine, and in the secondary tab, I want to issue those different commands. So the command that I want to work with is AWS DynamoDB, and scan is kind of the easy first one. So if I just do a generic scan, the only thing that I have to specify is what table am I actually scanning. Okay, so with the scan, it's going to take one parameter, which is the table name parameter. Okay, and the table name that I'm working with is baseball stats. Okay, and then because I want to look at my local instance, I do need a second parameter, which is going to be supplied by this endpoint URL to indicate that I'm looking at the baseball stats table that's on my local machine. Okay, so if I do this scan, it's going to scan my local machine for that baseball stats table, and I'm going to see all of the records. Okay, so if I look at that, I have 23 records in here. So this is the items that I have based on that scan. So each item, so you can see that there's a team record here. There's another team record here. It looks like there's a game record right here. And if I scroll down, so I'm going to scroll down by hitting the space bar. Okay, eventually I will run into the fact that there's a player record. Okay, and I can indicate that by seeing that the team ID begins with this player info underscore. That's going to tell me that I'm dealing with a player in this case. Okay, and if I keep scrolling down, I'll eventually reach the end, and you'll see that there's 23 records that I'm able to scan. Okay, so that's my scanned data. It's a collection of items that's represented by JSON. If we want to dig further into this JSON data set, each one of these curly braces is an object. So whether it's a game or a team or a player, it's going to be in these included curly braces. And then we have attributes about each one of them. So SK for the sort key, team ID is the partition key. Since we're dealing with a player, each player has a position, and each player has a player name. Okay. Additionally, for each attribute in the case of DynamoDB, there's also going to be a data type associated with the underlying data. Okay, so if I'm looking at all of my players, you'll notice that all of the data, so the sort key has a value of 5, the team ID has a value of player info underscore LAA, position has a value of 1B, player name is Albert Pujols. All of those corresponding values for the attributes are string related, and that's indicated with an S. Okay, if I run that command again, okay, so if I run that same command and we're looking at a game, you'll notice that when we're dealing with a game, we'll actually have a different type of data, which is a numeric data type. So the opposing team runs and the runs are both numbers. So if I wanted to do some kind of calculation like total runs scored by a team or run differential or anything like that, I could do those math things on that data. Okay. I can also, as we go on in this class, this is considered marshaled data. And marshaled data basically just means that there's a data type attribute or a data type associated with each value. Okay. I can also unmarshal this data if I just want the raw data. So I don't care that opposing team runs is a number. I just care that it has a value of 1. I can unmarshal that data to remove the data type association with it. I'm just introducing the terminology marshalling and unmarshalling right now. It's not really relevant for this because I don't want to deal with unmarshalling the data from the terminal window, but it will come up as we get deeper into this course. Okay, so I'm able to do a scan. Okay, and that looks at all of the records. If I want to do a scan, and let's say I wanted a specific player. So one of the players that we looked at was Albert Pujols. I think he was the last player in the data set. Or maybe Shohei Ohtani. Okay, so I know those 2 players are in the data set. What I can do is I can do a scan. Okay, so the scan's going to be the same. But then I introduce a couple of additional parameters. And the additional parameters are going to be, let's say I want a specific player. Okay, so I want to do a filter for a specific player. And what I'm going to do then is I'm going to introduce the parameter, which is the filter expression. Okay, so the filter expression is going to be that the player name is equal to some value. And I'm just going to set up a parameter called P here. Okay, I haven't identified what :P is. All it really is it's not a literal value :P. What it is I'm basically defining a parameter that I have to pass in. I have to define what :P is. Okay, and this has to do with SQL injection. So I'm not concatenating in saying, oh, I'm looking for a player whose player name is Albert Pujols or Shohei Ohtani or anything like that. What I'm doing is I'm saying I'm looking for a specific player, and that specific player is going to be identified by a parameter :P that I'm going to define later. I'll tell you what :P is as we go forward. Okay, so the filter expression, this is what I'm filtering for. And then I have to give you a value for :P. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to say, here's the expression attribute values. Okay, and the way the expression attribute values work is the expression attribute values is a JSON string. So it might look something like this. So I'm going to have, if I don't put quotes around it, so it needs to be quoted, but if I don't put quotes around it, the way it would typically work is I'd say, oh, there's a variable called :P that has a value of Albert Pujols. Okay, and in theory, this would be okay. Like, this is the correct JSON. I want the value of this variable :P to be Albert Pujols. But it's a little bit more complicated than the way I made it out to be, because all of this JSON needs to be quoted. Okay, so I have to put quotes around it. So I put a beginning quote and an ending quote. And by putting the beginning quote and ending quote there, I have issues because now I have the beginning quote right here where I've highlighted, and I have the ending quote right here where I've highlighted, but I have these quotes in between, so what ends up happening is it thinks this is a pair, and it says, oh, there's the beginning and the end. I don't know why there's additional stuff after this. Okay, so I really have to kind of stick to the fact that this one's the beginning, and this one's the ending, and all the stuff in between, I really mean that those should be part of the actual string that's included inside of the beginning and ending quotes. Okay, so what I have to do, I have to be a little bit careful about this. I'm just going to use a / character. Okay, so I'm escaping those to say I don't mean this to be the beginning or the end of my string. What I really mean there is the next character, I want it to be a literal double quote. Okay, and we're close. However, because this data needs to be marshaled, the value of P is not just Albert Pujols as a string. The value of P is a little bit more complicated. It's actually an object because I have to specify, just like this team ID, I have to specify that the value that I'm passing in is an actual string. So I'm actually saying :p is this object, kind of like what I have highlighted here, that's a string where the value is Albert Pujols, not games underscore LAA. So what I have to do is I have to be a little bit more descriptive in what :p is. So :p is actually an object that is a string. That's the value of the data that I'm going to pass in. And that object has a value, or has a string that's value is Albert Pujols, and then I can close the double quotes. Okay, so it starts to get a little bit messy in terms of syntax. Okay, but really that's how I'm defining what :p is. So :p is some object that is a string, and the string value is Albert Pujols. Okay, so I'm going to look and see if we can actually see what this player looks like. Okay, and you'll see what ends up happening is I do get that record back. So I think all the syntax that I put in there ended up being correct. I have a collection of items. There's only one record that matched that particular player, so you'll see the count is 1. And the way this works is because I'm doing a scan and a filter, because I'm doing the scan as my main command, what happens is I'm going to look at all the records, and then once I've already scanned all 23 records, then I can filter it down based on the filter expression, and I come up with one matching record on the filter. Okay? So that's what that's showing. If I were to run the same command, but I was looking for, let's say, Shohei Ohtani, and I might have a spelling issue there, but I think it's okay. You'll see I have one matching record there. Okay, it's a different matching record, but I have one matching record there. Okay. So I'm able to do a scan. I'm able to do a scan and filter. I can also do a query. Okay, so query is going to look a little bit different. So I'm going to do AWS DynamoDB. It's going to be query. And then I want to continue on. Again, the table name that I'm doing this query against is going to be baseball stats. That doesn't change. I'm working with my local instance, so my endpoint URL is going to be the same, localhost 8000. Okay. And then since I'm doing a query, my query has to be on a key. So I'm going to specify my key condition expression. Kind of like a where clause in a relational database. My key condition expression is going to be where tmyd, in case matters here, is equal to my parameter :t. And this should look a little bit familiar. So I'm specifying a key condition expression where I've defined a parameter :t, where I have to give you the value of what I think the tmyd should be. So let's say I was just looking for all the players that play for the Angels, because I'll get multiple records back in this case. So I want this :t to have a value that is this object. It's this object that has a tmyd, where the object value is, or the variable is s. I don't know what I copied there. I misclicked by accident, and you'll notice it filled in down below, so that's not great. Let me see if I can backspace that out. Looks like I can. That's good. So I was able to backspace it out. I had just misclicked. But I want the variable :t to be equal to the same value that is for all. I'm looking for all the records that have a tmyd of player info underscore LAA, which is all of the players that play for the Angels. Okay, and I think there's multiple records in this case. Okay, so the way I'm going to handle that is I'm going to supply the value of t by supplying the expression attribute values. Okay, so the expression attribute values, again, it's JSON. Okay, so if I just write out the raw JSON, sometimes I think it's easier to escape all the characters. So the raw JSON is going to be :t equal to some other JSON object, and that other JSON object is going to be a string that has a value of player info underscore LAA. Okay, so that's ultimately what I want my JSON to look like. But I'm going to run into complications because I have to put quotes around all of this. So if I put quotes around all of it, that's not really a big deal. But then I'm going to run into issues of where I have beginning and ending quotes, and I'd have to escape all of these quotes in the actual JSON. One thing I can do on my Mac terminal, and this is not universal, it does not work in a Windows command prompt. On a Mac terminal, I can say, oh, I actually am talking about a string, and I'm going to start the string with single quotes. I don't believe a Windows command prompt is going to allow that, but on my Mac it will. Okay, so I can go ahead and hit enter to this. And you'll notice I get a couple records. So Shohei Ohtani when he played for the Angels, Mike Trout for the Angels, Albert Pujols for the Angels. Okay, and it looks like Cole Calhoun for the Angels. I'm just hitting enter to go line by line. If I hit the space bar, it's paging down, and it looks like there's 4 matching records. Okay, and because I'm doing a query, I'm actually not looking at all the records. I'm only going to query the records that match that key condition expression. Okay, so if I hit Control C, I can hit the up arrow and run that command again. I use the single quotes, and I was on my Mac and it allowed me to do that. If I was not on my Mac, so let's say I was on a Windows command prompt and I wanted to do that, I can put beginning and ending double quotes there. But then there's some confusion about what's the start of the string and the end of the string. So I have to go back and I have to escape all of the double quotes inside of the actual string. So I'm just going to arrow through and put an escape character before all of them. And that should work as well. Okay, and you'll notice I get the same data set and the same results. Okay, whether I use a single quote to indicate the beginning and ending of the string, or if I kind of use the universal approach of escaping within my string all the actual literal double quotes that I have. Okay, so I'm able to do that query. Okay. I can also go a little further. So let's say I wanted to do a query like I just did, where I have all of the players that belong to the Angels. I could do a query where I'm looking for the team that is the Angels. Team info underscore LAA. So now I'm looking for a different data set. Okay, so I'm not looking for the players that belong to the Angels. I'm looking for the team that is the Angels. Okay, so I'm doing that query based on the fact that the team is the Angels. If I go back to the players, though, okay, so I'm looking at all the player records. Okay, so there's 4 player records. Let's say I wanted a specific player. Okay, so let's say I wanted Mike Trout. I could run my first scan and filter to get a specific player. But in that case, I was reading 23 records. But let's say I know that I want a player that belongs to the Angels, and I'm looking specifically for Mike Trout. Instead of scanning all 23 records, I can just scan the 4 Angel records, so the 4 players that belong to the Angels, and then I can filter based on the player name. And what that'll do is it'll reduce my cost because I'm paying for the number of records that I read. Okay, so if I want to do a query and filter, just like we did with a scan and filter, I can do that. So let me give you that example. So I want to do the same query, but I want to add an additional parameter here. So I'm going to back this up before I add the expression attribute values. I'm going to add a filter expression. And my filter expression is going to be player name equal to : P. Okay, so I have a filter expression. And now I have two variables, right? I have a variable in the key condition expression, and I have a variable in the filter expression. I want to supply both of those I want to supply values for both of those parameters, and the way I do that is I still do that through the expression attribute values. Okay, so the expression attribute values is still the key to this, and the expression attributes are still going to be defined through JSON. So I have to describe what :t is, and :t is some object that is a string that has a value of, and I'm looking for the team ID, so it's going to be player info underscore LAA. Okay, so that's the first bit of JSON that I need. Okay, but really that's one parameter, which is :t. That's this part, the inside the curly braces. But then I can use a comma to define what :p is. And :p is going to be similar. It's going to be an object that is a string. And since I'm looking for a specific player, that variable :p is going to have a name of Mike Trout, which is also an object. Okay, and again, I could take the shortcut out because I'm using a Mac. I could put single quotes around this whole JSON object. But if I want to be more universal in my approach, I can say, here's the start of my string by putting a double quote there. Here's the end of the string by putting a double quote at the end. And then the double quotes inside of there all have to be escaped. So I'm going to put backslashes in front of all of them. Okay, so the syntax is quite burdensome, but once you get used to it, it's actually not too bad. But there is a lot of syntax to it. Okay, so in this case, I'm supplying values for two different parameters. And now I should be able to run this because I think I have the syntax correct, and I'm doing a query with a filter. Okay, so you'll notice that I actually just scanned 4 of the 23 records because I'm doing a query. So it's telling me that I actually read 4 records, and that has to do with the fact that I'm doing a key condition expression team ID equal to player info underscore LAA. So I'm only reading the Angels players. That's part of the query. But then once I get down to those 4 Angels players that I've read, that's the scanned count. Once I've gotten down to those 4 Angels players, I'm doing a secondary thing, which is I'm doing a filter on that data to say, I actually don't need all of the Angels players. I actually just care about when the player name is a specific player name, and I define that specific player name as Mike Trout, and that's how I'm getting that one specific record. Okay, so I'm combining scan and query with filter. So the reality is I can scan all of my data. That's not a problem, and then I can always filter it down to just get the records I want. But I'm paying to read all of the data when I do a scan. When I do a query, I'm limited in what I can query because queries are based on key condition expressions. So in our data set, the only thing that I can query against is either the sort key or the partition key. Those are the only things that I can query against because those are the keys, which is going to limit my cost of how much data I'm reading because I'm only reading where the key matches. But then I can always filter the data set down after I've paid for that initial read if I don't care about all of the data that came back as the result of a query. So step 1 is decide whether I'm doing a scan or a query. Right? And sometimes that's determined for you based on the attribute that you're looking at, or maybe you don't have a choice. You have to look at all the data. And then step 2 is once I determine whether I'm doing a scan or query, what data do I actually care about, and I can filter it down based on any of the attributes in the record set. Okay, so this is just kind of showing you some syntax of how I'm doing scans, queries, and filters against a DynamoDB instance.